Welcome to episode 35 in the Torreya Guardians video series. I'm Connie Barlow. I'm the founder of Torreya Guardians back in 2005, and we are an entirely a volunteer citizen group conducting really the first assisted migration of an endangered listed plant. This is a subcanopy tree. In the United States, Florida Torreya taxifolia. It got started when the late Paul S. Martin, professor at the University of Arizona in Tucson, and I co-wrote a paper for the winter 2004-2005 issue of Wild Earth magazine, where we were advocating assisted migration. Bring Torreya taxifolia north now. Now, part of our advocacy was that from a deep time perspective, I mean, Paul is one of the most famous paleoecologists in North America. Is from a deep time perspective, Florida Torreya was hanging out during the Holocene, during this warm time, post-glaciation, where it had spent the coldest part of the glaciations. It had never been able to move back north after the glaciers retreated. It's called a peak glacial refuge, where it was in the northernmost part of Florida, out on the Panhandle, where one of the rivers that comes down from the southern Appalachians, the Chattahoochee River becomes the Apalachicola River, right in there. Tiny little place, and where it was hanging out in the bottom in the coolest parts of the ravines. Amazing it was able to hang on that long. Theory is that the large seeds, which you can see here, these large seeds, floated down the Chattahoochee River as the glaciers came in. Maybe as early as the Pliocene it started coming down, but it ended up having to be there in order to make it through the coldest times. And by golly, it couldn't float back up the river. We have 3 peak glacial refuges like that in North America, well known. This one in Florida from the Chattahoochee River. There's one to the east over at the Altamaha River, Franklinia Altamaha. Franklinia was found a couple hundred years ago by European colonists in here who were botanists, and then vanished. But you know what? They lived in Philadelphia, so they took some seeds back up to Philadelphia with them, and by golly, all the Franklinia that you can find now at public places planted horticulturally in New England come from them. So Franklinia is another tree that would have gone extinct for not having to float back up its river to get back into the Appalachians had not the botanists come along. And then there's another one that came down the Tennessee River into the Mississippi River, and then ended up down in that area, the Tunica Hills. Hazel Delcourt has reported on that one, and it's called Critchfield spruce, bigger cone than what we have in white spruce and certainly red spruce, and it went extinct. And so there we have, from our peak glacial refuges, a sense from starting in the west, gone extinct, going to the east, coming out in southern part of Georgia at the Atlantic Ocean there, would have gone extinct were it not for the botanists taking it back. And then finally, Torreya taxifolia, member of the yew family, evergreen conifer tree, will be going extinct in its native range. And the reason we started moving it is nobody was willing to. There's all this concern in the Fish and Wildlife Service and the botanical gardens working with them about, oh my gosh, might it become invasive? Well, right. Once you get a deep time perspective, all native trees and plants have been moving back and forth, up and down, north and south with each other for millions of years. This is not bringing in a plant species or a disease species from some other part of the world and crossing an ocean in order to get here. What we did in moving it north is what the Indigenous call helping forests walk. we were helping this move back north. And by golly, the indigenous did that for a lot of plants that were important to them. As the glaciers pulled out of the Great Lakes, I'm in southern Michigan here talking right now. This is my home state where I was born and raised and retired now with my husband. So we're here in Ypsilanti, Michigan. But we wouldn't have pawpaw here in this northernmost range of a subtropical species. We wouldn't have it here had not the indigenous brought it north. And there's a lot of other plants like that. So in my view, what we Torreya Guardians, colonizing, most of us colonizing ethnicity here, or recent immigrants, this is what the indigenous did before us. I don't know what's so controversial about it. We've been having a lot of problems with the Fish and Wildlife Service, with at least one of the 2 botanical gardens in Georgia that are in charge of how this listed plant gets helped, even to the point of at one time they were suggesting genetic engineering. When you have a glacial refuge and you have a plant living in the glacial refuge and only there, this tiny little area, any diseases that hit it there, unless it can be shown that it's from another continent or it's coming from other trees that came from another, whatever, unless you can show that, it's being taken down by a number of native diseases. And frankly, when this was listed in 1984, as one of the first endangered plants listed from the 1973 Endangered Species Act in the U.S., which, by the way, next year turns 50. When this got its first recovery plan in 1986, close to a dozen diseases and problems were recognized as what was killing it off in its native range, because even as of then, it was very rare for any of the regrowth coming back from the roots and dying back and back from the roots could ever get old enough to produce any seeds before it died back down to the roots again. You know, that's typical what went on with the American chestnut, certainly with the American elm, but those are exotic diseases. And in 2011, there was a University of Florida research pathologist, forest pathologist, specializes in finding pathologies and trying to find ways to cure them, especially now through CRISPR, genetic engineering, even though that's not been allowed to be implemented, suggesting that that's what ought to be done for this species. No, that's not. What you do first is see if it moving it north, has it rid of disease problems. Well, we did not have to be the first ones moving this north, because there were horticultural plantings that had gone on. This is an amazing tree. It's very old. It goes back to the Jurassic. Not as old as the ginkgo tree, but it's back there. It used to be circumpolar, all around the northern hemisphere. But went extinct in Europe in the Pliocene, would have gone extinct here in the east side of the United States had we not had rivers carrying it down to the south. And we still have species of Torreya, California Torreya, in the mountains of California that were able to survive there because mountains are so great. You can go up a mountain as it starts to get warm, you can come back down a mountain as it starts to get cool, you can go around to the north side as it starts to get warm, you stay on the north side of the mountain, you don't have as much sun, starts to get cold, you come around to this. You didn't have to move very far. But in the flatlands, the pine sandlands of the southeastern United States, it was only via the river, and it couldn't get back. So bottom line, what we did in Torreya Guardians is we got an increment of seeds from, to begin with, from the Biltmore Gardens, just a little bit west of Asheville, North Carolina, 300 miles outside, poleward of the native range in Florida. But they'd been planted there, I think in around 1939. Florida Torreya was planted there on the Biltmore estate. And so we were given seeds because there's an exception in the Endangered Species Act just for plants, not animals, an exception. That if there were horticultural plantings where the tree was growing or any kind of plant was growing that is later listed as endangered, those gardens, that private household estate that has it, anyone that already has it planted doesn't have to pull it out. And then when they produce seeds, what are you going to do? Throw away the seeds? No. We were authorized, we were the first ones to do this. It's very clear in the Endangered Species Act itself. I mean, the passed in '73, they weren't stupid. It was initially for wildlife, and then plants were thrown in at the end, and then the realization, oh my gosh, you know, sure, if you find a salamander growing in somebody's backyard pond 400 miles north of their range, you know that person brought it there illegally. But if you've got a plant growing in a horticultural garden, and certainly if it's documented like it is at the Biltmore estate, it's been there for a long time. And so that's where we initially got our seeds from in 2005, carried on beyond that. Well, here we are, November 12th, 2022, and we are still the only ones legally moving this north. I'm sure there's a number of botanical gardens that have been able to get seeds as experimental populations, more likely ex situ safeguarding, which means they're not allowed to do it for assisted migration. You're not trying to get it to go wild in a forest again, sub-canopy forest again. Not allowed to do that, just genetic safeguarding. Well, we've documented at Harbison House, this is a little west and south of Asheville, the Biltmore Gardens. Harbison House, here in 2022, it's pretty much a century old there now, a grove there. Unmanaged, untended, and we went there before the surrounding forest started to be clear-cut around the grove. We went there and we documented seedlings, we documented saplings, we showed it is completely capable of naturalizing back in the mountains of western North Carolina. Just a beautiful, rainy, very rugged area of North Carolina. It was doing very well there. We documented that it could naturalize well, but by golly, in the course of a century, the farthest it could disperse its seeds, probably by squirrels, plus maybe a little bit of gravity helping in there, was 40 yards. Okay, 40 yards in a century. How far is this glacial relict going to need to move in this century, and other trees move in this century that aren't endangered? Anybody living out in the Mountain West, California, even now in the Pacific Northwest, with the western red cedar, genus thuja out there, they're noticing what's going on here. The trees are dying unexpectedly. Nobody expected this. It's because they can't handle the drought, they can't handle the heat, and the bark beetles in particular that are killing the pines and the spruces, those bark beetles, they're not being killed off in the winter anymore. The winters are just too warm. So out west, there's no dispute at all that the main dangers this century to plants are just native species of diseases and beetles. It's in drought, and usually drought and warmth. You won't see a tree just wither from the drought. Normally what you see is it can no longer defend itself against diseases. It's not healthy enough to do that. Can't send out the sap when a bark beetle is trying to burrow in through the bark. I've watched them do this on a ponderosa pine, burrowing, trying to swim in as the tree is putting sap out to keep it out. If you're in a drought, you can't spare the sap coming back out of the tree like that. And so the bark beetles get in. And then in the winter, they're not killed off anymore. And so they get to have, instead of 1 or 2 generations a year, they get to have 3. And not killed off. So anyway, long story short is that here in the East, if we just do two things in terms of our worldview understanding and our science understanding. Number one, we take a deep time perspective. This is a glacial relic species, stranded, left behind in a peak glacial refuge. There is no difference about that. This was known back in 1905. A couple famous botanists published papers on that, and we put them on our torreyaguardians.org website for anyone to read. Somehow glacial relict, as the botanical gardens took over this operation, glacial relict, all that was in the initial listing of the plant and the first recovery plan have sort of dropped out. Nobody mentions that anymore. That is not fair to this plant. That is not genuine science. So, with that prelude, what I'm going to do now is simply give an example of what we do when we collect seeds from horticultural sites. This set here that you can see, I forget, maybe 400, I forget how many I've counted here. This one came from one private property in Clinton, North Carolina. Our collector this year went out and collected some there. It was a little different this year. The ownership has changed. Anytime ownership changes on private lands, we have trouble with that. We had a private landowner 2 years ago want to trim the female Torreya because it was growing so well in central North Carolina that it was coming out over the paved driveway and she couldn't get her car through anymore, so we had to do that. So it stopped seed production basically for a year, didn't get any seeds from there. And last year was when we went out to the Harbison house and saw for the first time the ownership had changed there too. Clear cut on two sides, but they didn't touch the grove. They didn't hurt the grove. So some of the seedlings that we documented, of course, are gone, but the three biggest saplings that the grove had put off over the past decades are still there. They were not cut. The new owners know this is important. And so on the bright side, more sun is coming in. And again, a subcanopy plant like this is Liriodendron, Tilia over it. And it's very patient. A subcanopy plant is not needing to produce seeds every year. This one will just kind of grow and wait and grow and wait, or not grow much and just hang out. Each of the leaflets lasts at least 5 years, sometimes as long as 7 years, photosynthesizing, evergreen. And we figure now with the openings that eventually there will be more seeds grown by the trees on the lighted side of this grove. So it will actually work to the advantage of the grove in producing more seeds. And we're really looking forward to getting more genetic diversity because the Biltmore isn't producing much anymore. They had a hurricane that wiped out the canopy, and they've had some other problems go on there with having to manage their site. But our other places are just great, and in fact, our volunteer, our planter in Cleveland, Ohio, just a little bit southeast of where I am now, when was it, 2017 and then big time 2018, his plantings of 4 Torreya, Florida Torreya trees started producing seeds in 2018, and this year I think he got about 250, 275. He sent us a beautiful picture of his seeds. And again, if you're planting them in a lawn area, it's in his front yard, and he mows around it, whatever. So what this means is that this subcanopy tree, when tended by humans that way, doesn't have to compete for sun. It can't grow fast enough. Any other canopy tree around it, if they start growing at the same time, will overtop it, and it'll remain subcanopy, going a little horizontal, but it's not going to be producing seeds, and it's not going to go very big. It waits for a tree fall. It waits for a canopy opening before it will finally shoot up and certainly start making seeds. But he's got seed production, really wonderful seed production. But in terms of getting more genetic diversity in when we're planning these things out, this is a sore point with me. I was live and let live in my philosophy with the Atlanta Botanical Garden and the State Botanical Garden of Georgia. They didn't want to do assisted migration, fine, we'll do it. I mean, 2011, two of us, Torreya Guardians, advocated for assisted migration in the update of the recovery plan, and everybody else on the panel voted no, so the Fish and Wildlife Service, bless their hearts, they tried, couldn't get it in. No experimentation with it. Okay? Things had gotten so bad that by the 2020 update, we were not even informed of it. We were not asked to participate. The draft was there and the comment period over. 6 months later, I learned about that. And we are completely bad news inside that recovery plan. In the 2011 update, the botanical gardens were told to cooperate with us. Not so. Part of the reason things have gotten so bad is we did have access for a while to one of the ex situ plantings. When this plant was listed in 1989 through 1991, excellent collections done in terms of lateral branchlets being cut and rooted from the wild genetics, as many of the wild genetics they could find. There weren't that many left anymore. I think a little over 1,000 maybe, but they didn't collect from all of them. And then they were cloned into 3 separate groups, so that 3 botanical gardens each got the same set of genetics, and they were rooting them themselves. Now, I don't know what happened with the Missouri Botanical Garden. It certainly would be capable of not being too cold there to grow Florida Torreya. But Harvard's Arnold Arboretum, gosh, the director of Living Collections is retired there now, but I knew him back in the 90s when I was working on my final book. I wrote 4 evolutionary ecology books in the 90s, but 2001 was my last book, The Ghosts of Evolution, and it was about plants in a deep time perspective. And of course, Arnold Arboretum, they once they got their seeds rooted, they had to send it back down to either Atlanta or the State Botanical Garden of Georgia, I forget which, because they couldn't just put them outside and have them grow into anything. It was Florida. They thought it wouldn't work. Well, it probably would, actually, now. But anyway, the point is that these plants were ultimately got too big for being within the botanical gardens themselves. They were getting root bound. They had to be planted out. These precious clones of the original genetics. Now, they could never get to be big trees because a branchlet cut is always going to think it's a branch as it roots, and it will never grow up into a tree form. It just won't. So these become, but uprooted branchlets can become huge, gorgeous shrubs. There's a cemetery north of Cincinnati where a couple of us have taken pictures of rooted branchlets there now, Florida Torreya, that are just growing gangbusters. But they're males, unfortunately, so there's no seeds we can get from them. But anyway, these were very responsibly planted out in ex situ genetic safeguarding locations far north in Georgia, getting up into the mountains, foothills kind of the Appalachian Mountains. And and they started producing seeds. Oh my gosh, when was it? 2007, I think they started producing seeds, at least at Atlanta. At least it was reported then. It stopped being reported in later years. But Ron Dieterman did a very responsible job at Atlanta Botanical Garden of both originally rooting those branchlets and then maintaining them until they needed to be planted out. And then no longer were the seeds accounted for. We were able to legally be given seeds. I think it was from about 2011 to 2015, and then it was stopped when staff changes happened at the State Botanical Garden of Georgia and the Atlanta Botanical Garden. Staff changes happened and boom, shut down. No more seeds available. Well, that's okay if somebody's collecting the seeds and moving them, doing something. This used to be considered the most endangered conifer in the world. No longer that. They found some other ones, but it still deserved to have all of its seeds regarded as precious. If there's anywhere you can plant them, you do, but they weren't. And it got to be so embarrassing. They never documented it, and you know how I know? In 2018, I launched a Freedom of Information Act query, FOIA query. And I simply asked, I said, I want to know whatever the government has documented from, I think, 2010, I think I asked, through 2017. In the 2 ex situ groves in North Georgia, I want to know estimates of seed production. Certainly you can at least do estimates of seed production, numbers of seeds produced, and ultimate destinations. And that came back nothing. Nothing. No data. No data at all. And still, if you go on the U.S. Fish and Wildlife website, 2022 now, so what's that, 4 years later, you go on there, you still cannot find any documentation about seed production in the ex situ groves, what their health is like. Nothing. You go on the Torreya Guardians website, the citizen site, totally unfunded, volunteer action. I'm the webmaster still, and by golly, we report things. Few people want to stay private. They don't want people. People have experience. People digging up and stealing trees because they're endangered. My gosh, these are precious. But for the most part, as I'm going to be doing here, I'm going to be reporting what we've learned so that in the future we can all together, I hope, government official people, I hope official botanical gardens, and certainly we'll continue doing the best that we can for helping this left behind peak glacial relict move poleward. One more thing I need to say, my long introduction where I got off into a little bit of a rant, but again, it's been 17 years that I've been working on this. And there is still not only no assisted migration going on, but an adamantcy about it, that the botanical gardens we used to send seeds to, we used to go visit in order for them to be part of the official Endangered Species Program. My understanding, they have to sign a memorandum of understanding that they are not engaged in assisted migration. Unbelievable to me, but maybe things will change. Maybe things will change. Nonetheless, for more information on that, and so that you don't just have to trust what I'm saying here, on the website there's a couple pages where you can see more detailed arguments and references. You can get to my Freedom of Information request. You can get to the published papers. There's all kinds of things you can get to there. 2 places that you can get to right from the home page. One, you'll see right from the home page, torreyaguardians.org, something called Case Study of Agency Failure. And the long version of it, when you click, a case study of agency and institutional, that means the Botanic Gardens, failure in implementing endangered species plant. And that's the Torreya Guardians example. We've actually been written up quite a bit in journals and news and papers and so forth. Look there, because there you're going to be able to see my objective arguments that I'm making without the emotional slant that I'm giving here. And again, a lot of references. The second thing to look at there is a topic called Endangerment causes. You can get there right from the homepage of Torreya Guardians. Endangerment causes. And there you'll see that what pops up, a really long web page. Extinction. You know, why? Why is this? And it goes through all of the arguments, old and new, pro and con, in terms of what I already mentioned about the old botanical papers claiming this is a relict left behind, glacial relict tree, and this is a glacial refuge where it got stuck. But also something I didn't talk about at all, and that's because it's so detailed. You really need to go there. Part of the problem that's happened in the last, pretty much since about 2016, 2017, is that there was a master's thesis written in 2011 where about 7 weeks study, a master's student was looking at branchlets of Torreya taxifolia and infusing them with a fusarium that had been distinguished on the plant. Now, for a long time, Fusarium lateritium, ever since the get-go, was one of the, it's a water mold, one of the dozen diseases always listed in the initial recovery plan. But in 2011, I think it was, maybe 2010, the pathologist that I already mentioned at the University of Florida did a research paper of not only distinguishing it structurally, genetically, and structurally using a kind of equipment that wasn't available back with the first recovery plan, and decided to call it a new species of genus Fusarium. Anytime Fusarium water mold is a problem for agriculture, boom, it gets studied. There may be a lot of Fusariums out there, probably Fusarium torreyae, that's been out there for a long time, but nobody's ever bothered to distinguish it because it wasn't attacking anything commercially important. In China, they have done that. So importantly, they did name it. They had 5 or 6 other, I think Asian, maybe 1 or 2 American Fusariums that they did a relational cladogram to. And were able to discern there at the time that it seemed most closely related to the known Asian species of Fusarium. But again, these are just the pathogens that have been studied. Nobody has identified the Fusarium that does attack the California Torreya, apparently if it's in bad locations. All the ones I've seen in the wild were growing great up on the mountains, the sub-canopy trees, or deep in the canyons by Santa Cruz. Fog comes in really cool. But anyway, the point is that there is no peer-reviewed paper that establishes that Fusarium torreyae is not native to North America. Okay? Somehow the word got out early on and one journalist picked it up. The probability that it was exotic and therefore you were invasive and it might attack other trees and so forth. No, it's not peer-reviewed. Second thing that master's thesis did was take a whole bunch of other tree species, at least 6, red spruce, Fraser fir, some other ones that you find in the southern Appalachians, conifers you find there, including the red spruce and the Fraser fir that have already topped out. Spruces needed to go north, and firs, balsam fir, needed to go north. But through the Holocene, there were one kind of spruce, a part of the red spruce population, and what's called Fraser fir, distinct from balsam fir that we have a lot of up here in the north. They headed up the mountain instead of heading north. And so with the acid rain that was happening in the Reagan era and other things, they were dying out on the highest mountains you can get to in the southern Appalachian and the Smokies. Huge distinction from the firs and the spruce farther north. Hundreds of miles distinction from them there. And so they tested them and, took them into a lab in Florida. I think it was Gainesville, Florida. took it into a lab there and tested whether you could infuse a branchlet, whether it can attack the spruce, the fir, all these other things. And I'm going, no. You don't do that without winter freeze coming in. You don't do that without the whole body of the tree and its mycorrhizae launching defenses against these others. It's not peer-reviewed. It's a master's thesis, and it called Torreya Guardians out in the very last paragraph as being dangerously putting into danger Fraser fir, red spruce, some other trees, simply because we were assisting migration into the northern states. Not peer-reviewed, and more than that, when you think about, okay, how could we test to see whether this Fusarium torreyae really is attacking Torreya in North Carolina and northward, and could possibly attack any of these other tree species? Well, you go and take a look at the horticultural sites, and my understanding is that at the Biltmore estate, the Fusarium torreyae, not lateritium, but torreyae, Fusarium torreyae, was actually found on the trees, on the Florida Torreya trees there. But it wasn't lethal there. That's the whole point about native diseases that trees have lived with for a long time, like the bark beetles out west that are native. They are only lethal for trees that are struggling, for whatever reason, struggling. So, as far as I'm concerned, that should have been proof. Get rid of this concern about the danger of Fusarium torreyae. But we were even in the beginning, it's like, okay, we're just working with seeds now, we'll peel them off, and if, give us some, if we need to put Clorox on them, whatever. Well, what I've heard, again, this is through the grapevine because there is no communication anymore between our citizens. We all operate independently. There's no board. We each do our own thing. But we communicate with one another. And from what I can ascertain, at least a year and a half ago, maybe two, the new strategy for safety that the Atlanta Botanical Garden was having in terms of why they weren't distributing seeds from their wonderful ex situ places in North Georgia was that the Fusarium torreyae has apparently, somebody found it inside the seeds, that you can't just like clean off the outside, but it's right in there. So in order to make sure that this Fusarium doesn't spread to other native trees in North America, if you're working for the official Endangered Species Program now, you won't find it. You won't find this protocol in the recovery plan itself, the current plan passed in 2020. But apparently it is the policy there for the Native Plant Society in Georgia and any botanical gardens collaborating with them, is that no seeds can go anywhere anymore from there. So, again, you don't have to listen to what I'm saying. I may have some things wrong here. But you can go to our Torreya Guardians website and get started looking at the official papers and documents there, again, by the two ways. Case study of agency failure and endangerment causes. And then try, if you can, to find anything on the federal website published as peer-reviewed papers anywhere. You go try. And maybe some year they'll start to show up there. So I apologize for saying things that sound bad against the Endangered Species Act. The Endangered Species Act passed in 1973 when I was in college still. It has been a star for me in the future. What it did early on for bald eagles, bringing them back, peregrine falcons. I mean, it's early on, it was very, very important. plants, again, they were almost not put into that act. And so now that in June the Biden administration came out with a proposed slight regulation change, they don't have to go to Congress for it, they just had to put it up for public comment, and you bet I commented on it. But it did for the first time put climate change adaptation in there. And that is, if you're dealing with an endangered species, animal or plant, that you're starting to ascertain that it's either invasive species or climate change that has made its historical range uninhabitable. You can't salvage that anymore. You can't go in and put fertilizer in and cut trees or do whatever. You can't do it anymore. For the first time, it's saying that you can use the existing experimental populations clause in the Endangered Species Act specifically for assisted migration, well, it doesn't say poleward, but to find a better climate, find a better habitat, even if it's not in historical range. So what I will be advocating, and hope I can find others to join with me, is the comment period's over, and I already put suggestions into the comments. The most important one is simply this: do not lump plants with animals. Animals need incredible frameworks, rules. You want to be kind to the animals. You don't want to remove them. You don't have any salamander or Mexican gray wolf making thousands of seeds. Offspring, you just don't have this happen. And so you don't have the kind of seeds that we have to work with plants. Also, once you put an animal out, they can move. And so you can't control, if something goes wrong, you can't just find them all and get rid of them. But with a plant, you can do that. I mean, my gosh, with these things, like I said at Harbison House, over the course of a century, the farthest squirrels on their own could move it was 40 yards. There's nothing dangerous here. So in order for the whole list of endangered plants, far more endangered plants on the endangered species list than animals, to have a chance to move forward in the future without having to get a whole lot of federal funding there. That federal funding is very important for the animals because they need extra attention. You can't just put an animal in your pocket and carry it somewhere and put a hole in the forest and plant it like I can do with seeds. So, the main thing I'll be advocating for is to make sure that whatever protocols are established for how these experimental populations for climate adaptation, assisted migration, whatever is necessary to specify how you do that for animals, keep plants different, keep it simple, and let the bulk of the money go to animals. It's not needed for plants. There's a lot that can be done just on a kitchen table like I'm doing here. May the forest be with you.